By the spring of 1945, Germany had become a nation of ruins. Cities lay in ashes, bridges collapsed into rivers, factories twisted into skeletons. The Reich had promised glory, but in its final months it gave only hunger. For German women trapped in shattered towns, survival meant scavenging for potato peels, boiling weeds in tin pots, and watching children's cheeks hollow until their eyes looked too large for their faces. When the American army reached the outskirts of Leipzig, Anneliese clutched her younger sister Greta's hand tightly. They had spent weeks in a cellar, living on stale crusts and rainwater. Their mother had died the winter before, their father lost on the Eastern Front. All that remained was fear of what would happen when the Americans came. Propaganda had drilled it into their ears. The Allies will starve you, shame you, strip away what little you have left. Rumors circulated of women dragged into the streets, paraded as trophies. Greta whispered, "They will punish us for the war." Anneliese squeezed her hand, but could not lie. She believed it too. The first encounter was not fire or chains. It was the heavy rumble of trucks and boots crunching through rubble. Soldiers in dusty uniforms appeared at the square, helmets tilted, rifles slung. The villagers froze, women clutching children, old men bowing their heads. An officer barked a command. An interpreter translated, "All civilians here are under protection. Stay calm. Food will be distributed." The word food barely registered. It seemed impossible. The women were herded into a line near the gutted church. Anneliese held Greta close, her heart hammering. She expected ridicule, perhaps blows. Instead, she watched as American soldiers unloaded wooden crates from the backs of trucks. From inside, they pulled out loaves of bread, still warm, steam faintly rising into the cool air. The smell hit. The crowd first, rich, yeasty, almost sweet. For many, it was a scent they had not known in years. Mothers began to weep before they even touched the bread. When Anneliese's turn came, a soldier placed a rough, dark loaf into her hands. She froze, staring at it as though it might vanish. The crust was thick, uneven, but warm. She pressed it against her cheek and nearly sobbed. Greta tore off a piece with trembling fingers, stuffing it into her mouth. Crumbs fell down her chin as she whispered, "It's real. It's real." Others broke down completely. One elderly woman fell to her knees, clutching the bread to her chest like a holy relic. Another mother cradled her infant with one arm, while feeding the child mashed bits of the loaf with the other. There were no taunts, no laughter. The soldiers moved steadily down the line, handing out loaves, sometimes gesturing with faint smiles. One young soldier caught Anneliese's gaze. He tapped his stomach, then the bread, then gave a small nod. She nodded back before she could stop herself. That night, in the cellar where she and Greta still slept, Anneliese tore the loaf carefully. She saved half for morning, though every fibre of her body screamed to devour it all. Greta giggled softly between mouthfuls, her eyes shining. For the first time in months, her laughter filled the room instead of sobs. Anneliese could not stop staring at the crust in her hands. The enemy fed us, she thought. Why? She scratched words onto the margin of an old hymn book she had carried through the war. Today I touched bread warm from an American oven. I thought they would starve us. Instead, they fed us. I do not know how to reconcile this. It feels like betrayal to weep with gratitude, but I did. The bread was coarse, not like the fine loaves she remembered from her childhood, but it tasted like life itself. It washed away, for a moment, the bitterness of hunger and the certainty of despair. And in that taste, Anneliese felt something she had not dared to imagine. Dignity returned, even in captivity. For the women of Leipzig, that first loaf became more than food. It became a symbol that survival against all expectation might still be possible. The next morning dawned with the sound of trucks again. The women of Leipzig stirred in their shelters, clutching what little remained of the bread they had been given. Most had eaten sparingly, nibbling at crusts, desperate to make the miracle last. Others had devoured it all, unable to resist hunger's command. Annalisa woke to find Greta sitting cross-legged, gnawing at the last piece. Crumbs dotted her lap. "I saved you half," she mumbled sheepishly. Annalisa smiled faintly and took the small offering. It was stale already, but she bit into it gratefully. Soon word spread through the square. More food was coming, and this time the Americans wanted civilians to gather near the factory ruins where a field kitchen had been set up. Skepticism rippled through the women. Why would soldiers waste rations on their enemies? Many whispered that it was a trick, a way to lure them into humiliation. But hunger drove them forward. When Annalisa and Greta reached the site shocked them again. Long metal cauldrons bubbled with steam. Soldiers ladled thick stew into tin bowls and passed them along to villagers. The smell of meat, viands and potatoes drifted across the rubble-strewn air. It was intoxicating. Children darted forward eagerly, their eyes wide. Some could barely lift the bowls. Mothers wept as they blew gently on the hot broth, feeding their little ones with trembling spoons. Annalisa and Greta stood frozen until a soldier beckoned them forward. He handed Annalisa a bowl heavy with stew. She clutched it tightly, warmth seeping through the tin into her palms. Greta leaned over eagerly, inhaling the scent. They sat together on a broken stone wall. Greta slurped hungrily, broth dribbling down her chin. Annalisa ate slowly, savouring each bite as though it were her last. She had not tasted meat in months. The vegetables were soft, the broth salty, the warmth spreading into her chest like fire. Tears pricked her eyes unbidden. All around them, the sounds of eating filled the ruins. The scrape of spoons, the sighs of relief, the occasional laughter of children rediscovering joy. For the first time in years, the air of a German town was filled not with sirens or bombs, but with the clatter of bowls and the murmur of gratitude. Yet beneath the relief lingered confusion. Clara, a widow from Dresden, whispered bitterly, "Do you not see? They feed us so we will forget what they have taken." Her words trembled with grief, but her spoon never paused. She ate every drop. Hannah, the older woman who had once spoken harshly, muttered, "Our leaders promised us victory and gave us starvation. These men promised nothing and gave us bread. What do we make of that?" No one answered. That night, Annalisa scratched another note into her hymn book. "I tasted stew from the hands of my enemy. My stomach rejoiced, but my heart wrestled. Is it weakness to feel gratitude? Or is it truth to admit kindness where it exists? I do not know. Only that Greta laughed today. And I cannot call that wrong." The guilt was heavy. For years they had been taught that Americans were monsters, intent on destroying German women. But the reality unfolding before them was different. Soldiers guarded them, yes, rifles always present. But the food was real, the respect undeniable. In the following days, the routine continued. Each morning the women walked to the field kitchen. Each day, bowls of stew, loaves of bread, sometimes even tins of jam were distributed. Hunger gave way to cautious strength. Faces filled out, eyes brightened. Children began to play again in the rubble, their voices rising with a vitality that war had nearly stolen. Still, whispers of unease persisted. Some women refused to meet the soldiers' eyes, eating quickly and retreating. Others, emboldened by small gestures, began to nod in thanks. One day Greta dared to say in halting English, "Thank you." The soldier who handed her the bread simply nodded, his expression unreadable. For Annalisa, the struggle was deepest at night. She lay awake, hearing her father's voice from long ago, speaking of loyalty to the fatherland. She remembered posters warning of the cruelty of enemies, and yet her belly was full, and her sister laughed in her sleep. Which vision was true? The question gnawed at her more than hunger ever had. As spring warmed into early summer, the Americans expanded their efforts. They began escorting groups of women and children to larger distribution points where Red Cross parcels were shared. There, Annalisa saw something that unsettled her further. Prisoners of war. WW2, men captured at the front, were being fed alongside civilians. Bowls clattered, bread passed hand to hand. Soldiers watched with wary eyes, but offered no jeers. The sight fractured something inside her. If even soldiers, once enemies on the battlefield, could eat side by side with Americans, then what meaning did the hatred of years still hold? One evening, as she and Greta walked back to their ruined home with half a loaf tucked in her apron, Annalisa whispered, "We expected punishment, Greta, but they give us bread. Perhaps they want to show the world they are not like us." Greta's reply was soft. "Perhaps they simply want to show we are human." The bread was coarse, sometimes burnt, sometimes stale, yet it tasted like a revelation, and in every bite the women carried the unsettling knowledge that mercy had come from the hands they had feared most. By June of 1945, the guns had gone silent. The Reich was gone, Berlin in ruins, its leaders dead or in chains. But for the women of Leipzig and the surrounding villages, the collapse of the war meant little more than another day of survival. Roofs were gone, wells fouled, and cupboards long empty. Hunger remained their most familiar companion. Yet alongside the hunger came something new, something they had never expected from the enemy: bread. Every morning, women and children queued at the square as the American field kitchens fired up their stoves. The soldiers handed out loaves, bowls of porridge, even tins of powdered milk. The routine became ritual. Mothers tore bread into pieces, sharing with children. Old men chewed slowly, their jaws weak from years of meager rations. And always, the same disbelief hovered in the air. Why? For Annalisa and Greta, the loaves became lifelines. Annalisa hid scraps under her apron to take home for later. Greta, ever impulsive, stuffed her cheeks full until she could hardly swallow, laughing through tears. The bread was coarse, sometimes burned, sometimes underbaked. But to them, it was manna. One afternoon, an American sergeant approached the women's line with an interpreter. He raised his voice. "This is not punishment. This is food. Take it. Eat it. Survive." The words echoed. For women who had spent years being told the enemy would destroy them, hearing such direct acknowledgement felt like stepping into another world. Some wept openly. Others clutched their loaves as though they might be stolen. When release orders came, the women left the camp with bread tucked into bags, aprons, even the folds of shawls. They carried it home as though it were treasure, and in a way it was. For months they had expected chains, humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, they returned to their ruined homes carrying bread warm from American ovens. Back in Leipzig, the devastation was everywhere. Streets choked with rubble, churches gutted, shops looted. Yet within the ruins, the women's most vivid memory was not the sight of destruction, but the smell of bread, the warmth of loaves against their hands. Annalisa wrote in her hymn book one final entry. "We were prepared for punishment. Instead, they gave us bread. I do not know how history will tell it, but I will remember that the first taste of life after the war came from the hands of those we feared most." Years passed. The memory of occupation faded beneath the rubble of rebuilding, the division of Germany, the Cold War. But for those women, the story of bread endured. They told it quietly to children, then to grandchildren. "When I was captured," one would say, "the Americans gave me bread instead of blows." Greta, older, now would tell her daughters, "It was coarse bread, heavy and dark, but I wept when I tasted it, because I realized then that the enemy had shown me more mercy than my own leaders ever had." Historians, tallying numbers and treaties, rarely recorded such moments. But in diaries tucked into attics, in whispered stories shared at kitchen tables, the memory lingered. Bread, simple, rough, ordinary, had become extraordinary. For many, it planted a question they never voiced aloud. If our enemies fed us, then who truly was the enemy? Annalisa, in her old age, sat in her garden watching children chase each other across the grass. She broke a loaf of bread and handed slices to them, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. The smell rose in the warm air, and for a moment she was back in Leipzig, 1945, a frightened young woman clutching a loaf given by a soldier she had been taught to hate. She smiled faintly. "It was only bread," she whispered, "but sometimes bread is enough to keep hope alive." The war had destroyed cities, claimed millions, erased nations. But for those women, the memory that outlasted it all was not of bombs or speeches, but of a loaf of bread pressed into their hands by the very men they had feared.